There was absolutely no way us humans could reign at the top of the food chain without using ranged weapons. In this harsh, cold survival of the fittest world, every self-respecting animal eventually evolved a legendary weapon over the past few millennia, from the deadly claws of the predators to the brutal horns and hooves of the titanic herbivores. Engaging these beasts 1v1 in melee range with the body of a man was an adventure at best, but realistically, just plain old suicide. I mean, there were no antibiotics back then, so even a small scratch could be a game-ending critical hit. With the invention of javelins and slings, we humans were able to topple bigger and meaner animals from afar to rise to be the king of the jungle, just like David and Goliath. And about 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic Age, we invented the pinnacle of ranged weapons, the bow, and it would be an irreplaceable part of our history. The bow transformed the energy from human muscles to an explosion of elastic energy that would shoot out an arrow. The bow was incomparably stronger and more efficient than any other ranged weapon around. It was only in the modern era, with the invention of gunpowder weapons, that bows could finally retire after thousands of years of war. Koreans, being the nation of ADCs they are still not done with the bow. I mean, it's difficult to find an instance of modern Olympics where Koreans didn't sweep all the gold medals for archery. After a quick trip down the intermingled history of the bow and Korea, it's pretty obvious why Koreans have always been so good at archery. The bow was a revolutionary weapon. I mean, yeah, it dealt a bit less piercing type damage than a good old full swing to the head, but in a world without antibiotics, the dot damage from infection was often good enough. You may not be able to one-shot an enemy with a bow and arrow, but you could count on it to take an enemy out of battle. The range was the best part of the bow, which could go up to 300 meters or 330 yards depending on the type. A well-trained archer would be able to rapid-fire 10 arrows every single minute. Take into account how you typically have tens or hundreds of archers firing volleys of eventual death during a battle, and you can understand why so many countries desperately wanted to have a strong marksman squad in their armies. However, the bow came with significant disadvantages as well, the most prominent of them being the fact that it's really difficult to train a good archer. Battle bows were packed with tension for power, which meant that it required a hell of a lot of strength to even pull back the bowstring in the first place. Unlike the future gunpowder weapons, which are basically instant hit scans, the bow's arching projectiles required predicting enemy movement. To be considered good with a bow, and I'm not exaggerating here, you literally had to be training hardcore from the very moment you could walk. Now, try to simultaneously calculate the complex variables of wind speed, range, enemy movement, and it becomes obvious why good archers needed to experience a lot of battles firsthand and live through them all. As you can see, archery was a really difficult craft to master, which meant that each individual archer was treated like a national treasure. Hey, I know what you're thinking. Instead of training up 10 expert archers, why not just take 100 brutes who could pull a bowstring, line them up, and spam fire World War I trench warfare style? Well, that's because the bow is really difficult to make in the first place. How hard can it be? You just put a bit of string on some flexy wood, right? Well, yes, and that's how humans created the first bow, aptly named the simple bow. And the simple bow sucked. Any respectable nation with a professional archer battalion would need to invest in making composite bows by combining woods of different tensile strength along with metals or animal horns. Back then, smithing a good composite bow required the full mobilization of every single technology the nation managed to unlock so far, which meant that the crafting and delicate maintenance of a single bow was cripplingly expensive. Of course, arrows weren't that simple to make either. You had to find the right tree, carefully carve a shaft, then attach the arrowhead and some feathers in a meticulous manner if you wanted it to ever, kill someone. The bow was an overpowered item, yes, but the daunting difficulty of crafting it and training archers made it somewhat balanced. Meanwhile, humans everywhere around the globe started to adapt this tech according to their specific environment, like weather, geography, politics, or resources. The idea of launching missiles through tensile strength remained the same, but the unique environments shaped the materials, components, use cases, and appearances. Humid climates preferred the simple bow made of a single material, while dry climates preferred a composite bow made of all sorts of materials, and this wasn't just because of a technological gap. No, this was a logical, time-tested decision because a composite bow required a lot of glue to, glue all the different materials together, but humid climates and their constant moisture kept ruining the glue, if not melting it outright. And this is why countries like Britain or Japan liked using the long bows. Being surrounded by water on all sides made their environments humid, which ruled out the composite bows. But then where do you get that piercing power? Well, you can kinda make up for it by having really, really long bows. Fun fact, the Japanese in particular tend to be shorter on average, which meant that the ever-growing bows would eventually hit the ground and reach a hard limit. The Japanese overcame this hurdle by placing the handle lower and creating this asymmetric monstrosity. It looks really inconvenient to use at first glance, but apparently the samurais liked it because the recoil wasn't that bad and they could shoot it on horseback. On the other hand, the drier climates were relatively free to pick and mix whatever materials they could find lying around to make a composite bow. Iterate over a few millennia, and each dry climate civilization more or less found the optimal formula for maximizing power and convenience without making the bows unreasonably long. Instead, these bows focus more on pulling the strings back way further while maintaining a short length. The best composite bows, of course, came from the northern nomads who had access to a bunch of animals wandering around. These abundant animals could be dissected for valuable components like horns, bones, and tendons, which is why the nomads glued bones on wood to make the bone bow or horns for the horn bow. Best of all, the small size of the bow made it perfect for shooting while galloping on horseback, and boy did they abuse this. Just like every controversial subject, everybody in the world had their own views on archery back then. Some people considered it an essential everyday art worthy of worship, while others hated it for being a dishonorable, dirty way to fight. The best examples of the latter would be the modern-day Europe and Mediterranean regions. They weren't concentrated into giant nations yet, instead existing as a scattered bunch of small city-states. They didn't have that many people, and most certainly could not afford to maintain a full-time professional army. I mean, their soldiers were literally civilian farmers and merchants conscripted out of the blue, so good luck training them to be professional archers in a few weeks. No, the best way to extract value from these useless peasants would be to throw them a shield and tell them to hold a line. This is why the shield wall meta worked so well back then. When the medieval era rolled around, Europe got obsessed with knights and honor. These knights would be each maxed out with suits of armor, shields, helmets, and even horse armor to the point where they were literally the tanks of their time. Well, that's not very archery of them, and no wonder they got steamrolled by the Mongols, who instead literally worshipped the bow. Just like the city-states, the nomads didn't have a massive population. However, they didn't have to waste time farming because they kept moving around and hunting or raiding for food. For the nomads, using a bow wasn't just for specialized battle. It was literally their way of surviving. It just so happened that their addiction to horses was the perfect combination with archery. Just mounting a horse automatically gave them the high ground, and the insane mobility of the horse allowed them to easily kite and whittle down the enemy cavalry. Was it a dishonorable way to fight? Probably, but it was a bit more honorable than bleeding out in a ditch. The nomads had an inferior population size and industrial capability to begin with compared to the sedentary civilizations, so each fallen warrior hurt them disproportionately. Therefore, kiting around and striking from safety was the only logical strategy for them. Needless to say, getting cheesed by the same archers on horseback strategy over and over again wasn't fun for the sedentary civilizations, so they too had to learn archery themselves or deal with it. So, what about Korea? Korea too suffered from centuries of harassment by the marksman raiders on horseback. The only way for Koreans to survive was to master the crafting of bows and mass-produce archers. If you go way back in Korean history to the Goguryeo dynasty, from 37 BC to 668 AD, there was a time where the Koreans too used the same archers on horseback strategy to blaze through the plains of Manchuria. For Koreans, the bow has always represented a weapon to be mastered over a lifetime, regardless of gender or social class since the ancient days. The Korean people have been trapped in this claustrophobic peninsula since the days of the Goryeo dynasty in 918. 70% of this unfortunate land is made up of mountains, and there's nowhere to run to during the regularly scheduled nomadic invasions because, peninsula. So, the only logical strategy was to run to the mountains and bunker down in a mountain fortress to fight to the bitter end, which meant that investing in more archers was never a bad option. Oh, and it wasn't just the feared nomadic hordes that would consistently raise Korea. Every time some dynasty managed to unite China, it would march an overwhelming torrent of soldiers to invade this peninsula. The Koreans, of course, were no match for the deathball Chinese in terms of army size or weapons, which was why they would try to avoid a fair and square frontal confrontation at all costs. No, the Koreans would use the mountains, castles, or whatever dirty cheese tactics they could to avoid fighting in melee range against an overwhelming swarm of men. As far as Korea was concerned, making a decent archer out of every single able-bodied Korean was a necessary investment. Therefore, the bow and arrow have been an irreplaceable part of Korean history for millennia. All the renowned founders of Korean dynasties, from Jumong of Goguryeo, the ancient Korean version of King Arthur in 58 BC, all the way to Taejo of Joseon in 1335, were godly marksmen according to legend. Even ordinary peasants have been using the bow for recreational purposes, showing off their archery skills whenever there was a wager for drinks or money. So, now, I really wasn't exaggerating when I said that Korea was the nation of ADCs. Korea had to keep designing better and better bows to keep up with the national obsession with archery, coming up with high-quality mastercrafts like the Mekgung, Hwanmokgung, or Nokakgung. The pinnacle of 1,000 years of forging tech was a Hukakgung from the Joseon dynasty. As the most high-end warbow Korea could offer, it was a composite shortbow made by smithing a bull's horn in wood. The Hukak in Hukakgung means water buffalo horn, and it was considered the best crafting ingredient because this beauty was long and curvy enough to use in its entirety straight out of the box, or rather, cow's carcass. This legendary class item was way too precious for ordinary peasants to use for shits and giggles, which is why civilians enjoyed archery with regular wooden or bamboo bows. The arrow was just as important as the bow because, the arrow is the one doing all the killing at the end of the day. Koreans developed different arrows specialized for each purpose or desired range. The most unique and deadly? The Pyeonjeon, an abnormally tiny arrow. Well, what's the big deal? Doesn't that just mean less range and power? You see, the Koreans launched the Pyeonjeon from a straw-like tube called the tonga. When the archer released the bowstring, it would shoot out from the tonga like a railgun, allowing the archer to pull back the bowstrings to maximum capacity despite its short length. Sounds simple, but let me tell you why this was so feared in battle. The firing motion was basically non-existent from afar because the rail would still be in the archer's hand, and the bolts were too small and fast for the human eye to react to anyway. Furthermore, the Pyeonjeon was basically useless without the tonga, which prevented enemies from plucking bolts from the bodies of their friends and firing it straight back at the Koreans. A skilled Korean archer with one of these Hukakgungs back then was the closest thing to a modern sniper, shooting lightning-fast, hit-scan, unreactable death from afar. But this superweapon came with drawbacks too, pun definitely intended. Remember how the hukak is made from the horn of a water buffalo? Well, the problem is that water buffaloes don't live in Korea. They had to import them from neighbors like China or Japan, and well, turns out that these specific neighbors are the ones always trying to invade Korea. Korea did try to breed these water buffaloes domestically, but they couldn't because of the difference in climate, and Korea went back to begging for weapons parts to fight off their invaders from their invaders. The problems didn't end after the initial creation. This composite, though, was unreasonably high maintenance and sensitive to humidity. The glue used to attach the water buffalo horns to wood came from the boiled swim bladders of fish, and this fish glue would immediately melt upon contact with water. You had to keep the precious hukgakungs safe inside a temperature and humidity controlled room all the time, and don't even think about using them during summers because of the regular monsoon season. So, yeah, the hukgakgung was very powerful and most definitely feared by Korea's enemies for centuries, but it was also way too difficult to produce domestically and completely useless during the summer. These were huge drawbacks, which is why Korea eventually caught up with the rest of the world and started using guns from the 17th century onward. The jochong, or Istinger matchlock gun, wasn't perfect by any means because of its complicated reloading process and reliance on the unpredictable gunpowder. However, the learning curve was much easier because all you had to do was know how to point and click to fire. Most importantly, Korea was able to produce gunpowder domestically without having to rely on its enemies. But you can't use gunpowder weapons when it's raining. Well, you couldn't use the Korean bows when it's raining either, so not a deal breaker. By 1894, Korea no longer required its soldiers to be archers and rendered archery obsolete. Final nail in the coffin? Japan occupied Korea in 1910 and literally banned archery within Korea for peace of mind against a popular uprising. The nuclear bomb brought about Korea's independence in 1945, but the Korean War started 5 years later and decimated the vast majority of archery infrastructure and technology. Korea's tradition of archery is still somewhat preserved to this day in the form of sports. However, only the archery that the upper class practiced managed to survive the Korean War and Japanese occupation. The rest, the archery involving bamboo or wooden bows that everyday commoners enjoyed, however, seemed to have been lost in history forever. That being said, the aimbot DNA from the nation of ADCs seem to have been preserved, as is evidenced by how Koreans are still objectively the best at archery. This has been David Bradford from Knowledge Raiders, and please let me know if you like this new experimental format better in the comments down below.